You think distance means they stopped caring, but what if the truth is more complicated than silence? And what you're seeing is not absence of feeling, but absence of emotional capacity to stay. Welcome back to Decoder's Mind, where we break down the hidden psychology behind relationships and uncover what silent behavior, emotional distance, and confusing actions really mean in love and attachment. When someone pulls away after they've hurt you, the first instinct is usually to read that distance as a kind of verdict. It can feel like proof that what you shared with them didn't matter enough for them to stay, to explain themselves, or to face what happened. That interpretation makes sense emotionally, because when someone goes silent or steps back, it naturally feels like rejection.
But that conclusion often misses what is actually happening underneath, especially when the person involved has avoidant attachment patterns. For someone like that, distance is not always a sign of not caring. It is not a clean emotional shutdown or a simple loss of interest. It is usually much more conflicted internally. What looks like indifference from the outside is often self-protection on the inside. When emotions become too intense, too exposing, or too hard for them to manage, their system reacts by creating space. Not because they feel nothing, but because they feel too much and don't know how to hold it safely. The moment they realize they have hurt you, something shifts inside them in a way that can feel destabilizing. It is not just guilt in a simple sense. It is the awareness of impact. It is the recognition that they have caused emotional damage, and now there is an unspoken expectation to respond, to repair, to engage emotionally. That kind of moment removes their usual sense of control. For someone who relies on emotional distance and self-containment to feel stable, that sudden pressure can feel overwhelming. Instead of moving closer to fix things, they often do the opposite. They step back in order to calm what is happening inside them. From your point of view, that withdrawal can look cold. It can feel like they don't care enough to make things right. But internally, it is usually not that simple. Their mind is trying to reduce emotional overload. It is trying to escape a state that feels confusing, heavy, and hard to sit with. In that state, their thinking often becomes protective. They may not consciously decide it, but thoughts start forming in the background like, if I stay close, I'll make it worse, or I don't know how to fix this properly, or I should step away until things settle. So distance starts to feel like the safest option available, even if it doesn't actually solve anything. This is where the real misunderstanding happens. Because while they experience space as relief or regulation, you experience it as abandonment. You are left holding the emotional weight of what happened, needing clarity, acknowledgement, or even just presence. Instead, you get silence, and silence rarely feels neutral. It feels like continuation of the original hurt. It adds another layer on top of the first wound, because now there is not only the pain of what happened, but also the pain of being left without repair. What is important to understand is that this kind of avoidant response is not primarily focused on healing the relationship. It is focused on stabilizing the self. Those are two very different things. Healing requires staying engaged, tolerating discomfort, taking accountability, and remaining present through emotional tension. It requires facing what happened directly and working through it with consistency. Self-regulation in avoidant patterns, however, often prioritizes immediate emotional relief. So instead of staying in the discomfort long enough to repair it, the person steps away from it, not realizing that in doing so they are often extending the emotional gap rather than closing it. There is another layer to this as well. For many avoidant individuals, closeness is already mixed with tension. It is not only connection, it is also vulnerability, exposure, and the risk of losing control over their emotional state. So when conflict happens and they have hurt someone, closeness becomes even more loaded. Now it is not just intimacy, it is accountability too. If someone does not have the internal capacity to stay present in that kind of emotional pressure, then withdrawal becomes automatic. But the problem is that this protection is aimed at discomfort, not actual danger. And in trying to avoid discomfort, they often create disconnection, which is exactly what they fear at a deeper level. This is the painful contradiction in the pattern. The behavior meant to protect the relationship often contributes to its breakdown. From your side, this creates confusion. You may be dealing with someone who still has emotional depth internally, who still feels things, but whose behavior no longer reflects that. Someone who pulls away at the exact moment when clarity, repair, and communication are needed most. That is why it becomes so important not to equate distance with your value or with the worth of what you shared. Distance in this context says more about their emotional coping system than it does about your importance to them. But understanding this does not mean you are meant to carry the emotional cost indefinitely. Intent does not cancel impact. Even if their withdrawal comes from overwhelm or fear, the outcome for you is still the same: absence, lack of response, and unresolved emotional pain. So the real question shifts. It is not only about why they withdraw, but also about what that withdrawal means for you over time. Do you keep waiting for clarity that never fully arrives? Do you keep trying to interpret silence as something meaningful? Or do you start recognizing that emotional responsibility requires consistent action, not just internal feeling? Because when someone repeatedly avoids repair, the result is not neutral space, it becomes emotional delay, and repeated delay eventually turns into emotional loss. There is also something else that often sits underneath this behavior: guilt. But not the kind of guilt that leads to repair. More often it becomes a heavy internal feeling that doesn't translate into action. Instead of pushing them to reconnect, it can turn inward in a harsh way. It shifts from "I should fix this" into something like "I am the problem" or "I cause harm." And that identity can feel too uncomfortable to face directly. So rather than moving toward you to repair what happened, they move away from the emotional meaning of it. They create internal explanations that make distance feel necessary. Thoughts like "if I go back I'll make it worse," or "I won't handle it properly," or "I'll lose control again" start to form. These thoughts are not always fully conscious, but they help reduce emotional pressure. And because they reduce pressure, they reinforce the behavior. Distance starts to feel justified, even responsible, when in reality it is avoidance of emotional discomfort. Real responsibility does not remove you from what you caused. It requires staying present with it long enough to understand it and take action to repair it. That is exactly where this pattern struggles the most. The difficulty is that guilt does not disappear with distance. It often stays in the background. It shows up in quiet moments, in reflection, in awareness that something is unresolved. But instead of pushing repair, it can reinforce the belief that returning would be too difficult or emotionally overwhelming. So the avoidance becomes self-reinforcing. The more they feel they have failed, the less capable they feel of returning to fix it. From your perspective, this becomes especially confusing because in healthier emotional dynamics, guilt usually leads to action. It leads to apology, communication, and repair. So when none of that happens, it can feel like nothing is being felt at all. But in avoidant patterns, feeling something internally does not always translate into behavior. And relationships are not sustained by internal emotion alone. They are sustained by what people actually do. This is why unresolved guilt can sometimes feel worse than no guilt at all, because it creates emotional tension without resolution. Everything stays suspended. Nothing fully closes. You are left in a space where you sense something is there, but nothing changes. And that kind of in-between state keeps you emotionally engaged even when there is no real movement forward. You start questioning yourself. You start wondering if you are asking for too much or misreading the situation. But silence in this context is not neutral. It is absence of repair. And regardless of the internal reason behind it, the outcome remains the same: no clarity, no closure, no resolution. That is why understanding the psychology behind it should never replace your own emotional needs. Empathy is important, but it cannot replace accountability. Awareness of someone's inner struggle should not become a reason to ignore your own experience, because at some point, the reason behind the withdrawal matters less than the impact it creates. And the impact is simple. If someone's guilt prevents them from showing up, communicating, or repairing what happened, then that guilt is not supporting the relationship. It is keeping it stuck. You cannot build emotional safety with someone who only processes things internally, but stays absent externally. And here is another truth that often feels difficult to accept. They can miss you and still not come back. They can think about you, feel your absence, even revisit memories and still remain where they are. Because feeling something is not the same as acting on it. For some people that feeling stays contained. It does not become movement. It does not become communication. It does not become repair. It stays internal, almost like something they observe rather than act upon. Over time, that distance can even reshape how they remember you. The intensity softens, the conflict fades. And what remains is a version of the connection that feels easier to hold emotionally. Without the pressure of real interaction, you become something they think about, not someone they actively reach out to. And even then, returning would mean stepping back into emotional reality. It would mean facing what was left unresolved. It would mean dealing with uncertainty again. And for someone already inclined to avoid emotional pressure, that step often feels too heavy to take. So they remain where it feels emotionally safer, more in thought than in action. And this is where the gap between you and them becomes most painful. From your side, love and connection are proven through presence, through effort, through showing up, especially when things are not easy. So when someone goes silent, doesn't reach out, doesn't try to repair what was broken, it naturally feels like a clear message. It feels like you didn't matter enough. But the truth is often more complicated, and in many ways more frustrating. It is not that you didn't matter. It is that what you brought up in them emotionally required a level of capacity they are not currently able to hold. So instead of stepping into that emotional responsibility, they retreat into a version of the connection that exists only in their mind, where nothing is demanded from them. This creates a very real imbalance. You are dealing with the actual relationship as it happened, with real words, real actions, real wounds that need repair. They are dealing with a mental version of it, shaped by memory, emotion, and selective reflection, something they can think about without being overwhelmed. And those two realities don't meet. You are responding to something lived, they are responding to something remembered. And memory, unlike real life, does not require accountability. It doesn't ask for apologies. It doesn't demand repair. It allows feeling without responsibility. But that kind of emotional existence is incomplete, because real connection is not built on feeling alone. It is built on action, on effort, on the willingness to move towards someone, not just think about them from a distance. When that movement is missing, the connection starts to weaken in reality, even if it still exists in their mind. So you end up in a confusing situation. Someone may still think about you, still feel something for you, still recognize your importance, and yet remain completely absent from your life. And naturally you hope that what they feel internally will eventually turn into action. That emotion will become strong enough to overcome fear or avoidance. But that shift doesn't happen just because time passes. Feeling deeply is not the same as being ready to act. Until those two things align, nothing truly changes in behavior. And this is where the clarity has to come in. You cannot build anything stable on someone's internal experience of you. Thoughts, memories, emotions that never become action cannot create security. They cannot create consistency. They cannot create trust. Because what is not expressed cannot be shared. And what is not shared cannot be maintained in a real relationship. When you combine all of this, the distance, the silence, the guilt that turns inward, you begin to see the core tension in avoidant dynamics. It is not just that they leave, it is that they leave while still emotionally conflicted. Inside them, two forces exist at the same time. One part wants closeness, connection, emotional safety. The other part fears what that closeness will demand: vulnerability, accountability, emotional exposure, and the risk of being overwhelmed. So what you are dealing with is not someone who feels nothing. It is someone who feels inconsistently in action. There are moments of awareness, emotion, even longing, but those moments don't translate into stable behavior. And that makes detachment difficult because the situation is not clearly empty. If it were empty, the mind would eventually accept it. But when emotion exists without action, It creates space for interpretation, for hope, for waiting. Maybe they will come back later. Maybe they just need time. Maybe distance will make them realize something. But time alone does not resolve this kind of internal conflict. Space alone does not create readiness. Silence alone does not produce clarity. In many avoidant patterns, time actually reinforces distance because the nervous system learns that separation feels safer. So the longer the distance continues, the more normal it becomes internally. And the idea of returning feels more emotionally heavy, not lighter. The conflict does not disappear. It just becomes quieter on the outside. That's why it is important to stop interpreting internal struggle as guaranteed potential. Just because someone feels conflicted does not mean they are moving toward change. Awareness does not automatically become action. Emotional depth does not automatically create consistency. What matters is whether feelings translate into behavior that is stable, accountable, and repair-oriented. Without that, the relationship cannot become secure. So the question is not whether they feel something. The question is what that feeling actually produces. Does it lead them closer, or does it keep bringing them back into distance? In the end, what you need to understand is that internal emotions, memories, or silent guilt are not enough to sustain a real connection. What defines a relationship is not what someone feels privately, but what they consistently do in reality. When someone repeatedly pulls away instead of showing up, the pattern itself becomes the truth you have to deal with, no matter what they may feel inside. Emotional conflict, fear, or avoidance may explain their behavior, but it does not replace responsibility or create stability. So the conclusion is simple but important. You cannot build emotional security on potential, silence, or unspoken feelings. You can only build it on consistent presence, action, and effort. And when those are missing over time, you are no longer dealing with uncertainty. You are dealing with a pattern. If this helped you understand what's really going on beneath the silence, make sure you like the video, subscribe to ***, decode his mind ***, and hit the bell icon so you never miss what most people never notice in relationships. And if this message resonated with you, comment clarity below. I want to know you truly understood the depth of this.